Two. There we go. It's now recording. Please just stay on mute for the presentation, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I encourage you to put questions into the chat as we go along, or save them for the end, and Shreyas can answer them. And before we dive into the presentation, I wanted to give some brief background on who we are and our work at the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. My name is Catherine Goldberg. I'm a senior fellow with the lab. So our work really centers around combining geopolitical dynamics, industrial policy work, and net zero supply chains. These are the factors we consider when we look at how to develop robust analysis and recommendations to countries on strengthening net zero industrial policy. We work in three work streams. The first is our industrial base team, and most recently this team launched the Clean Industrial Competitiveness Explorer, which is our online model that predicts competitiveness across all countries in final product exports for 10 clean technologies. It's on our website. I really encourage you to check it out because it's designed to help identify where countries can invest their limited resources in order to maximize their export efficiency across clean technologies. The second work stream is our regional team. You'll hear today from Shreyas, our India lead. We also have colleagues who are experts in Mexico and Brazil and work with these countries to develop tailored green industrial policies and recommendations. And then finally, we have the global team, which engages across different multilateral fora, including the G7, the G20, the UNFCCC, the IEA, and others to help inject principles and frameworks that are important for robust, clean industrial policy. Before we dive into the India work with Shreyas, I wanted to just give a bit of background on our other regional work, because we do hope to host webinars on Brazil and Mexico in the coming months. But this is an example of a decarbonization platform that we launched for Brazil several months ago. We partnered with a local think tank in Brazil, and it's cool because it overlays company level investments, as you can see here, across different clean technologies. So here this is pointing to a BYD plant, but you can also look at battery investments, wind and solar, and more, really at the state level in Brazil. We also hope to launch a similar thing for Mexico in the coming months. This will be, again, at the state level in Mexico, breaking down which states are strongest in which different clean technology policies, and then again mapping with firm level investments, as well as some national policies related to green industrial policy. Here's an example of what the firm level investments will look like. And then before we kick off, a couple of background pieces on our India work. We're expecting to release a similar state level green industrial policy mapping as what I just showed from Brazil and Mexico. We'll plan to release something similar for India over the coming months. As you'll hear from Shreyas today, he led a series of roundtables with industry experts in India earlier this year, which talked about addressing manufacturing challenges in battery and solar manufacturing. And then finally, if you're interested in learning more about our India work, please feel free to check out this publication that Shreyas published last year, which is about how India can really maximize its potential in the global clean energy transition. And with that, I'm really thrilled to introduce Shreyas Shende, who is going to take us through the rest of this webinar today. Shreyas is our Senior Research Associate and India lead at the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab. His research focuses on industrial policy, South Asian security, and India's energy and public policy landscape. Shreyas previously worked at think tanks in New Delhi, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., He co-authored a book chapter on the Research and Analysis Wing, India's spy agency, and his work has appeared in leading media outlets. Last year, Shreyas won the Next Generation Strategic Thinker Prize, which is awarded by India's World Magazine and the Institute of Foreign Service at the Ministry of External Affairs of India. We're really thrilled to have Shreyas here to tell us all he knows about India. And with that, I will kick it over to you, Shreyas. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. I hope I'm audible. Yeah. Um, okay. For everyone joining us for this call, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. As Catherine mentioned, I'm Senior Research Associate at the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab, and I work with the lab's co-director Bentley on the India desk. Just a quick run of show. I'll be talking about the industry roundtables that we organized. Why did we do this? What did we do? Who participated? And then I'm going to talk about battery energy storage systems and solar PV. I will do this thematically, what the policy landscape looks like for BESS, provide some context to the domestic manufacturing capabilities and projections, and then spend the bulk of my time looking at some of the key takeaways that we had from the industry roundtables. And all of these takeaways will be organized thematically. And in the spirit of constructive engagement, they will also include some policy recommendations that came through the conversations themselves, but also through some of the work that we are doing at the lab. Catherine, if you could go to the next slide. So the industry roundtables, successful industrial policy entails close interaction between all stakeholders. I'm just putting up sort of two quotes on the slide here. One is by Danny Roderick from his Green Industrial Policy piece, and the other is from the more recent World Bank Group report on industrial policy for development. Both of these reports and works on industrial policy identify the critical interactions that need to take place between various stakeholders for successful policy. The concept note that we had put out for the roundtable itself noted that the feedback loop between policy and practice is not optional, it's a necessary component of what will drive good policy. We organized these roundtables in February 2026 in New Delhi, in person and online. And this was the first such edition that we organized. There'll be follow-on roundtables as well. We are planning the next one in the next 8 to 10 months. And the idea is to keep the conversation moving forward and learning more from folks who are on the ground. Um, the next slide, please. Yeah. Who are the stakeholders that were present for both these roundtables? So we did two separate roundtables, one focused on BESS and one focused on solar PV. I have just sort of laid out what the ecosystem looks like here, and every icon that is encircled saw representation at the roundtable. So we had cell manufacturers, system integrators, recycling firms. For the BESS roundtable, for the solar PV roundtable, we had again cell manufacturers, wafer manufacturing units, vertically integrated units. And for both the roundtables, we also had a healthy representation from leading R&D institutions, trade bodies, industry associations, and other scholars who work on the field. I will now spend sort of half my time talking about BESS and provide some background to what the kind of policies that exist and what our capabilities look like, and then dive into some of the industry roundtables. Takeaways, sorry. Catherine, the next slide. Um, so these are some of the select policies and initiatives that the government has instituted for battery storage manufacturing. As this table makes clear, the government has instituted several policies to spur the domestic ecosystem, and policies range from regulatory measures such as the explicit recognition of S as an integral part of the power system in 2022 to demand side and market side measures like the waiver of ISTS charges and funding schemes, as well as supply side and manufacturing focus measures like the PLI scheme. What does India's sort of domestic capabilities look like at the moment? That's on the next slide. According to the according to the Central Electricity Authority housed within the Ministry of Power, There are requirements of about 236 gigawatt hours of just BESS requirements by 2031, and this is going to rise to 1840 gigawatt hours by 2047. As of December 2025, the cumulative capacity stands at less than 1 gigawatt per hour. Industry estimates say that this number is going to go up to 346 gigawatt hour by 2033. And this is based on sort of projects that have been announced, are where tenders have been awarded, or projects that are under construction as of now. Um, Notwithstanding the number of policies that I showed in the previous slide, the domestic BESS manufacturing ecosystem remains at a nascent stage. One example of this is the Government of India's flagship program scheme, the PLI scheme. It doesn't just target energy storage systems, but the government has set a target of having 50 gigawatt hours of domestic cell manufacturing capacity, of which 10 gigawatt hour is earmarked for grid scale storage. Of these 50 gigawatt hours, 40 have been awarded to four beneficiary firms. And here it's useful to note that all the selected firms are domestic players, despite the scheme explicitly calling for large domestic and international players to establish their manufacturing facilities. And of the total 40 gigawatt hours of awarded capacity, as of March 2026, only 1 gigawatt hour capacity has been installed thus far. Catherine, if you could just, there's another data point in here. Yeah. According to ISA estimates, between 2018 and 2026, a total of 117 gigawatt hours tenders were issued, of which only 5.6 is operational, which represents around 4% of what has been awarded so far. So, what were some of the key takeaways from the best roundtables that we did? As I mentioned, I'm going to organize these takeaways thematically, and the first we have is what the policy and regulatory environment looks like. For folks in the room, I think one of the key concerns was not just the fragmented policy landscape in terms of the number of ministries and regulators that need to be addressed or dealt with in some way. So, for battery energy storage systems, you, in some shape or form, are interacting with MNRE, which is the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, with the Ministry of Heavy Industries, Ministry of Power, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Commerce, and then with a range of regulators at both at the national and state level. Um, Folks said that one of the points that um, came across through the government through government interaction was that there was considerably much more upstream focus over the last 3 to 4 years. And the question here was, how do you look at the gains that come from endeavors such as this? Calculating domestic and foreign direct investment in mining projects is one way to measure interest in the upstream segment. And as folks on the call may know, there has been next to no foreign investment in mining projects, demonstrating the very limited impact of the policy focus on the upstream segments. That being said, it is important to note here that a lot of the upstream projects that the government is targeting will have much, much longer gestation periods. So we'll have to see how those projects pan out. Some of the other concerns related to market volatility, this in this focusing on geopolitical factors, overcapacity in China, commodity price fluctuations, and the other concern was around duty exemptions. While this is welcomed by certain segments of manufacturers, there's a broader question about the government's strategy in bolstering domestic BESS manufacturing capabilities. In the short term, such measures will help lower costs for manufacturers, but in the absence of a medium to longer term strategy, policy moves like PCD exemptions deepen the dependencies in the manufacturing ecosystem. Some recommendations that we had. Um, Most government policies targeting the development of battery manufacturing are technologically agnostic. Policies like the PLI scheme or the viability gap funding disregard the level of technology that is available, that is able to establish battery technologies that are not commercially viable currently. The government can actually can consider implementing a tiered set of policies, anchoring policies like the PLI or VGF on deployment-linked subsidies for established battery chemistries like LFP or NMC, and then have tiered policies such as offtake guarantees for sodium-ion pilots and R&D and technology readiness level bridging grants for solid state batteries. Such an approach, with established medium to long term policy timelines, will enable the government and firms to gauge mineral requirements for varied critical material profiles, but also help meet battery chemistries at the level of the readiness. Another sort of recommendation is anchoring demand. Battery demand for BESS is currently limited, with energy storage expected to rise rapidly only after 2030, with battery demand currently primarily led by EVs. The government can and needs to help anchor demand, as domestic battery firms have raised concerns about demand uncertainty, financial viability, and significant capital costs associated with BESS projects. Um, the next sort of slide. On manufacturing landscape, this was the perspective from on the ground players, manufacturing firms who are just getting started. But as of now, as of 2026, the manufacturing ecosystem is highly limited. Um, there were also concerns about chemical materials development. Most large-scale manufacturers have limited capacity or have demonstrated negligible appetite to engage in chemical materials development. Small-scale manufacturing firms that are investing in R&D don't have the requisite capabilities that are required for scaling up chemical materials projects. The other issue is revolving around capital requirements. Again, this has to do with the volatility in the BESS market, which is driven by geopolitical factors, China's dominance in the battery value chain, and this raises already substantial upfront capital costs that are required for setting up BESS manufacturing units. And then there are significant upstream dependencies. India remains heavily reliant on imports for its BESS, and this is something that the government acknowledges and is aware of. This is particularly pronounced for key upstream materials, which include battery grade coke, which is either needle coke or specialized pet coke, as well as for anode materials like lithium ion cells. Um, the recommendations that we had was in addition to sequencing policy by chemistry and by anchoring demand, the government should also be looking towards the medium to long term to try and figure out how it can develop a workforce and talent pipeline. And this can be done through specialized courses, which can be co-designed with the industry, which focus on each segment of the battery value chain. But this is also particularly important for the battery pack assembly segment, which is in the short to medium term, given the dearth of talent. This is something that will be important. The next slide looks at recycling. Participants were very clear that recycling presents one of the single biggest opportunities for India in the medium to long term if the appropriate enabling environment is put in place. One very important sign of this is the Critical Mineral Recycling Incentive Scheme that was approved in September 2025. And for industry players, this represents a very strong signal and lays the foundation for recycling. The scheme targets lithium-ion batteries, e-waste, and other wastes. And while this is presenting a strong policy signal, there were concerns about the level of funding that is allocated. As of now, the total funding is allocated is about 1,485 crores, which is spent over a span of 6 financial years. And the total incentives is actually determined by the type of cycling and the kind of beneficiary group that applies for this. Um, while this is one pathway that the government can take to incentivize recycling, participants also noted that the recycling industry is at a nascent stage with the potential for substantial growth if the enabling environment is present. This includes formalizing the already and predominantly informal workforce and also potentially extending the scheme to include R2 types of recyclers with built-in stipulations on how selected firms can move up the value chain towards actual extraction and not just collection. The other concern revolved around the EPR frameworks. The extended producer responsibility framework is a market-based framework that promotes the circular economy. Such a framework holds producers, including manufacturers, importers, assemblers, responsible for environmentally sound management after the end of life of such products. This was first notified in 2022 with subsequent amendments in 23 and 24. Participants note that the EPR framework provides an opportunity for product innovation, And it hinges on the Central Pollution Control Boards, the CPCB, which will be responsible for registration and compliance monitoring. With limited recycling as of 2025 and concerns around regulatory standards and enforcement mechanisms, strengthening the CPCB to ensure proper compliance is critical. And these are also some of the recommendations that were put in place. The other interesting topic that came up in the conversation was the recycling technology. We had a recycling firm in the room, and two folks on call, and all of them pointed out that much of the recycling technology, including the capital goods that are important for recycling, are currently imported from China. These are designed for the Chinese context and are not necessarily well suited for the Indian context. Um, there are interesting solutions here. The Center for Materials for Electronics Technology, which is an autonomous scientific society within METI, for instance, has developed indigenous technology for the recovery of valuable metal contents from discarded lithium-ion batteries, and is actually now working with domestic firms to try and scale this up and get this at a commercial level. And you have firms such as Epic Energy and Nav Prakriti, which have signed tech transfer agreements. But it is important that recycling technology also addresses indigenous concerns and is suited to your local context. The second last thematic point that came up for discussion during the BESS roundtable was focused on R&D, and that's on the next slide. Here again, much of the topic focused on chemical materials development, their high port dependencies, and very limited manufacturing depth. The Ministry of Power has underlined the importance of investing in R&D, and there was an analysis of 250 publicly funded energy storage R&D projects, which revealed that electrical and electrochemical storage chemistries actually accounted for over four-fifths of the total, with most focusing on lithium ion. While there is a growing section of private firms that are investing in alternate chemistries, at the moment there are only a handful of such actors. And the government should actually be working to try and figure out how it can devise policies for battery cell technologies based on the technology readiness levels, TRL, as opposed to sort of having battery and chemistry agnostic policy at every level. Um, Another important point that sort of came up was on the question of tech transfers, and this will be addressed in the China segment of the BESS landscape as well. But participants noted that several leading domestic battery manufacturing firms are partnering with foreign firms. And while certain partnerships or joint ventures may entail technology transfers, there was concern about the extent of tech transfers that is taking place. This was primarily directed towards Chinese firms, and here I have just prepared on the next slide sort of a select example of some of the leading battery manufacturers, the kind of battery chemistry that they're investing in, and their technology partner. Um, Most of the firms that are sort of engaging with China have yet to see explicit tech transfers happening, or some of these projects have just stalled. And even if private firms want to engage with Indian domestic counterparts, there are reports about how the Chinese government is actively stalling the movement of know-how and people into India. And this was a concern that came up repeatedly during the conversations. Finally, the last thematic key takeaway for the best discussion was on the China issue. Here again, the concern was around tech transfers. What is the extent and scope of tech transfers that are being pursued? Import dependencies. The participants highlighted the continued import dependencies for key upstream components, and this extends to sort of cathode active materials, anode active materials. And also, then there were questions around different storage chemistries. China has already started investing in sodium ion battery storage chemistries to bring it to commercial viability. What level of readiness is India at, and how can it learn from its Chinese counterparts? This was sort of the overview of what the battery energy storage conversations were. I'll very quickly move on to sort of solar PV. Um, this is just sort of a deck that tries to put together every single major policy and initiative that the government of India had for strengthening the solar PV, for building and strengthening the solar PV manufacturing capabilities. And here I have put it in the context of John Weiss's taxonomy of industrial policy, which basically segments each industrial policy according to the kind of instrument that it is, whether it is a product market investment or if it's a public goods node. Um, as Table 1, as this table sort of illustrates, the central government has deployed a wide array of policies and initiatives, and India's solar PV policy toolkit actually leans much more heavily towards product market activities, which is basically adjusting the impact of prices received or paid, or charging or changing tax rates, or by instituting government procurement policies to create and broaden the market for domestic suppliers. What do our capabilities look like, our domestic capabilities at the moment? And that's on the next slide. India has made significant strides in the downstream stages of the solar PV value chain. This chart is organized by value chain stage, and if you will notice, each panel has its own y-axis. Um, Most of India's capabilities currently exist in the downstream segments, with India's upstream capabilities for polysilicon and ingot/wafer highly limited as of now. But we will start seeing some gains going out to 2030, according to market, industry body, government estimates. And all of these data points have been collected through media reports, firm level press releases, and government sources. What did the solar PV industry roundtable sort of focus on? Again, these will be organized thematically, and the first focus on the policy and regulatory environment on the next slide. Um, we are well aware that the domestic industry has strengthened considerably over the last decade. You will, as I showed in the previous slide, you will see increasing capacity, especially in upstream segments of the solar PV value chain, coming online in the next 5 to 10 years. We should also not discount the impact that distribution side policies such as PM Surya or PM Kusun policies have played in shaping the industry. Um, Participants noted that the government could well consider creating a national roadmap for the solar industry over the medium to long term to provide policy signals to industry and also direct R&D efforts. This could be something that could be sort of envisioned over the next decade, decade and a half. The other important sort of point that came up while talking about the policy and regulatory environment, and this was raised both by R&D, by scientists, and by manufacturing firms, was the ALM scheme has been crucial in building up the domestic industry. And even though sort of it went through a lot of back and forth in terms of how the scheme was designed, implemented, and instituted, folks did appreciate the role that the scheme has played. An interesting suggestion that came up was instituting an ALM scheme for key ancillary products in the solar module value chain, and this is primarily because of our continued dependencies for key equipment and capital goods, not just in the value chain but also in the process chain. On the manufacturing ecosystem landscape, that's the next thematic point. A leading manufacturer of solar modules who was in the room stated that key decisions around manufacturing of their products actually hinge on three factors: efficiency, energy, and cost. And right now, there is very limited sort of vendors for key machineries, and most of these are sourced externally. There are limitations when it comes to uh, uh, key machineries, and the government, industry, and academia should actively be mapping what the ecosystem looks like to identify both deficiencies but also dependencies. There was also an interesting conversation on some of the key components and how geopolitical volatility, commodity fluctuations impact such component availability. An example is silver paste. This is a critical component that goes into solar cell manufacturing, and materials research for this product is highly limited in the Indian context. We had a very senior scientist in the room who highlighted an example where silver paste was actually developed by a leading institution in roughly half a decade ago, but there was absolutely no support that was received from the government or industry despite repeated requests. Um, And silver paste, which is a key material, has actually seen a lot of fluctuation. In 2025, silver rallied almost 130%, and the PV sector accounts for over 17% of the total silver demand as of 2025. Um, so uh, there are key components, including junction boxes, diamond wire saws, silver paste, that are pretty important that don't receive as much sort of policy attention as is required according to the folks who were in the room. The other important point that came up was, with decreasing LCOE for solar PV, what will be the broader implications for manufacturers and the government's own solar policies? This is something that needs recognition by the government much more than by the firms. The next point was on R&D. There were certain scientists in the room who said that domestic firms actually continue to seek external experts for key R&D and manufacturing projects. There has been a sea change in how the funding landscape has changed, both in terms of the quantum of funding that is provided for R&D projects, but also the level of access. And this is perhaps a well-known sort of deficiency in the Indian ecosystem, but firms invest very limited resources towards R&D. Um, Much of the process innovation actually happens on the factory floors, which necessitates academic, government, industry collaboration. We had an Indian scientist in the room who actually reflected on their experience at a Chinese R&D lab. They recounted their visit to the state key lab of PV Science and Technology in Changzhou, China. The lab, it's government funded, government supporters, is actually housed within the headquarters of Trina Solar, which is one of China's leading solar manufacturers. And the lab focuses on investigating novel mechanisms for achieving high efficiency photovoltaic conversions in crystalline silicon cells and advancing industrializations, and houses more than 200 permanent members and has a number of patents to its name. The interesting part is that the R&D lab is government funded, government backed, but it is housed within a private firm and is used by a range of actors. Are there innovative examples that your Indian policymakers and the Indian government can learn from? The other thematic takeaway that came up during the solar PV conversation was focused on China. And a number of firms actually sort of pointed out that, there are a lot of comparisons that are made between the Indian ecosystem and the Chinese ecosystem. Um, they asked me to they asked not just me, but sort of policymakers to keep in mind the differences both in the time scale and the level of resources that are invested in these particular industries. Just to provide an example, India first set up its national solar mission in 2010 and really accelerated its efforts post 2017, 2018 to spur the solar PV manufacturing landscape. Just to provide some context, the Chinese industry went from a few nascent startups to becoming a world leader between 2000 and 2007. By 2008, of the top 10 leading solar PV manufacturers, 8 were already Chinese. So by 2008, China had a world leading position in this particular industry. And this is 2 years before India had even instituted a national solar policy. So those timelines are helpful to keep in mind while undertaking comparisons between India and China. And the other has to do with sort of the level of state support that Chinese firms received. I'll very briefly show what those figures look like. But some of the other China-related factors that came up in conversation had to do with the fact that the Chinese industry, while dominant, is also characterized by a significant share of loss-making firms that receive considerable support from local and state governments. And a central challenge for Indian policymakers is to figure out how to create and then also protect domestic industries. Just what is the level of support that Chinese firms get? And this is on the next slide. Um, the figure on the left shows is from the OECD's MAGIC database, which is on industrial subsidies. According to this database, the production of solar cells and modules was on average the most subsidized industry between 2005 and 2024, with subsidies representing nearly 3.2% of firms' revenue against the overall MAGIC database, the OECD MAGIC database. And this has resulted in sustained imbalances between supply and demand and just a financial hardship for the industry. And this is according to the OECD. In addition to sort of expansive government support, leading solar manufacturers in China, excuse me, have engaged in deflationary price wars, with firms often selling at below cost to undercut competitors. And leading Chinese firms, solar firms' net income has actually been in the red since 2023. And the Chinese government, as folks will know, have voiced concerns about involution, which is excessive production that leads to race to the bottom in prices. And the chart on the right is just some of China's leading solar firms and their financial standing. That sort of wraps up some of the key takeaways that happened across both these roundtables. And just on the final slide, we have a reiteration. On the next slide, Catherine, a reiteration of some of the key recommendations that we have. Just a note for all the listeners, we will be releasing a policy brief on both the BESS roundtable, but also the solar PV roundtable within this month. So please stay tuned for that. And we can open up the conversation to any questions that we might have. I'll just address one comment that yes, this focuses on India. Apologies if you're disappointed. I thought we'd made it pretty clear in the webinar sort of details. But this roundtable was actually just we had Indian stakeholders in the room to try and understand what is happening at the Indian sort of at within India. But yeah.
Thanks, Shreyas. This was great. A lot to chew on. And wondering if we have any questions. I think that folks will have to put questions in the chat. So I'll wait for a couple to come in. But in the meantime, maybe I can kick it off with a question for you, Shreyas. You talked a lot about the importance of research and development to help build out or respond to some of the challenges that India is facing. And so I just wanted to know if you could talk a bit more about the opportunities or what would need to happen on the R&D landscape, investments in India. I mean, in particular, there are definitely smaller companies that probably wouldn't have the ability to do as much R&D. So where does the government need to step in? And what could be an opportunity there?
Sure. It was at the roundtable, it was helpful to have manufacturing firms as well as scholars, but also research scientists in the room. And, we had a recycling firm who had spent some time at IIT Gandhinagar talking about the kind of research projects that are pursued by leading R&D institutions. And the benefit of doing a roundtable like this is you get sort of a cross section of views on, how do you offer policy solutions? And there were quite a few sort of definitive policy solutions that came up. One was by strengthening academia, industry, and R&D tracks. One way to do this is reach out to firms, identify according to value chain segments, what are some of the 10 or 15 most thorny applied research questions that firms face that firms may not have the bandwidth to address, and then allocate these applied research firms either directly through DST funding or by going out to R&D institutions themselves and asking them, any are these applied research questions that you could potentially work on and help industry? Another policy solution that came up was the question of investing in design R&D as opposed to process R&D. And there's a difference here because India has considerable capabilities in design R&D, and it comes at a relatively lesser cost. And finally, the third solution that I already spoke about, and this has to do with battery energy storage, but um, trying to reach customers and policies at the level of chemistry development as opposed to having chemistry agnostic policies. Uh, as I mentioned, most government policies that are targeting the development of the battery manufacturing ecosystem are technologically agnostic. By disregarding the level of technology, you're also in some way undercutting the growth of nascent technologies or technologies which are at the TRL 4 to 7 level, which require some support. And the government can explicitly look towards R&D and TRL bridging grants for these levels of technologies. And the government already has a scheme in place, the RDI scheme, which sort of was announced last year, instituted this year. We'll have to see how that pans out, but there's considerable amount of capital that is allocated for R&D projects.
Thanks. And maybe a follow-up question. When the government thinks about where to allocate that funding, do you have a sense of what their process is like to engage stakeholders within India to better understand where investments could be most effective?
On the RDI scheme itself, the government is currently in the process of setting up a body that is actually modeled along the National Science Foundation, the American National Science Foundation, and here it basically entails very close interaction with not just industry but also with R&D institutions. There have been some calls that have been put out for funding, but I think, and this is a challenge that remains, smaller firms don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the resources to be able to sort of address government calls like this. And here it actually might be helpful for the government to sort of have know-how webinars, know-how seminars where they actively engage some of the more nascent, smaller R&D firms, um, and engage them to try and explain sort of what expectations are with the RDI scheme, but also the level of support the government can provide.
Great. And those are some of the insights that it seems like you've pulled away from these roundtables and can bring back to the governments as well. I see we've got a question in the chat. The growth in capacity of module as well as potentially cell manufacturing is quite impressive. Was there any discussion of whether some of the capacity will not actually be productive? It's a good question. So relating to productivity and capacity growth.
Yeah, and Dr. Vasi, thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for your engagement as well. For folks who may not know, Dr. Jir Vashi is at IIT Bombay. He's done tremendous work on sort of moving the needle in solars in the manufacturing landscape here. And yes, this was one of the concerns that was raised, right? And this has to do with sort of the LCOE of solar PV. With decreasing cost, how many of these projects will remain competitive? How many of these projects will actually finish timelines? And here it is important to sort of keep in mind the gap between announcements, estimates that go out sort of in the medium to long term and what are our current capabilities. And that's why I found it helpful to sort of contrast not just the level of policy support and the number of policies that the government has announced, but also really place our current manufacturing capabilities in context. Right now, for solar PV, for instance, we are well aware that actually most of our capabilities at the moment exist in the downstream segments of the value chain, right? Most of the upstream segment capabilities are either announced or in the planning stage, but we will have to basically see how many of these will actually pan out and be productive and competitive. Similarly, for the battery energy storage ecosystem, right now, industry estimates go out that we'll have upwards of 300 gigawatt hours capacity by 2030. And the government estimates that we'll require close to around 200 something odd gigawatt hours by in the next 10-15 years. But it is important to keep in mind that our current capability is less than 1 gigawatt hour. Um, so you're right that there is a differential in what is our announced capacity and what is our expected capacity. And it is important for the government to keep in mind how much of this will actually pan out and how many of these projects will remain competitive.
Thanks, Shreyas. Looks like we've got now two more questions. The first is, multiple policy supports have been provided across the solar value chain, and more targeted interventions are expected. However, as the domestic manufacturing capacity builds out, what are the opportunities and challenges for the manufacturers to diversify into new markets, considering the recent ADD/CVD issues in exporting to the US, which is the biggest market?
Um, yeah, Deepak, thank you for that question. It is. There is no doubt that the trade tensions and the tariffs between India and US have impacted some of the exports. Manufacturing firms that were in the room said that some of them are still trying to figure out how to get around this, but at the end of the day, it's simply a question of the price differential. Is your product cost competitive? And the case with some of these challenges is that when there are additional tariff barriers that are imposed, it is very difficult for Indian firms to sort of um, compete with these additional prices. And there are no sort of easy answers to this. One way, and this is something that I had written about in a different context, but the one way that the government could consider sort of navigating this is to actively work with firms to identify which are some of the new markets that may be much more amenable to Indian products. And in this regard, some of the work that we have done on the Clean Industrial Capabilities Explorer is helpful because we have backend data on sort of trade figures. We can actually try and figure out what India's export patterns look like and what are some of the markets that India um, is building out. Some of these markets um, may not be necessarily sort of at the scale of the United States right now, but there are sort of interesting green shoots that are showing, and some of this has to do with Middle East markets, and this was prior to the Iran war, so we don't know what impact that will have. But one of the things that we had recommended for solar PV was having a India solar growth sort of plan, having a medium to long term plan that where government can send a policy signal, not just in terms of sort of the levels of R&D it's planning, the kind of capital support can provide, but also really identifying how much of India's manufacturing sort of capabilities is going to be earmarked for exports as opposed to for its domestic market. And here, these kind of signals sent to the manufacturing firms will be helpful to try and identify how much of these firms should actually be going outside looking at new markets.
Thanks, Shreyas. Okay, I see we've got another question about recycling and then a couple about tech transfer. So, first on recycling, can you speak a bit more about the recycling landscape and the specific challenges faced in formalizing this ecosystem?
Yeah, very quickly. So the critical mineral recycling incentive, which was approved in September 2025, it presents a very strong signal and actually lays the foundation for upstream recycling. And it targets not just lithium-ion batteries, but also e-waste and other waste. The challenge with the scheme is that it actually targets larger firms that capture some of the more formalized segments of this. But the issue is that India is the third largest e-waste generator, just in terms of global volumes. I think it accounts for roughly 6 to 7%. But the issue is that it has a recycling rate of 10%. The global average is around 22%. And much of the e-waste recycling ecosystem is highly entrenched, highly informal. And this is the part of the sort of recycling market that has the formidable hold. So that makes it difficult to divert these material resources to the formal sector. There are innovative policy measures that the government can take, which is by including R2 categories of recyclers and getting them to sort of stipulate that they will be integrating and formalizing their workforce, but also not just indulging in the collection, but also indulging in the process of processing the black mass. And the other interesting point is that the government has actually developed autonomous indigenous recycling technologies that it has worked with Indian private firms to sort of make sure that these are commercially available. These are currently in the planning stages, but it's interesting to see where this might go.
Thanks, Shreyas. And let's take these last questions together. I think these will be the last ones before we wrap up. Um, on tech transfer, first, could you explain what exactly is meant by technology transfer? Is it licensing, co-development, business models, or what? And then following on to that, what are the primary constraints on tech transfer for Indian enterprises? And to what extent are these driven by reluctance of suppliers across both Chinese and Western firms versus demand side factors such as cost and regulatory barriers?
Yeah. Just should we take the other question as well, Catherine? I think Noel had a question on. Sorry, that's but Noel, I think Shayak had. Okay, so both of these questions
Yeah,
I
go
can
ahead
address
and take them
together.
all together. Yeah.
Um, just on the issue of tech transfer, I'm just going to give you sort of two examples of firms that have both signed on China as a technology partner and how these two sort of ended up panning out. The first one was Reliance New Energy. It's trying to develop LFP battery chemistry, and it had signed on. It had attempted to sign on China as a technology partner. It was in talks with Xiamen Lithium Energy Storage to license cell technology, and these talks stalled following Chinese export curbs. And Reliance actually has an established plant that is ready to go, but it is unable to sort of begin commercial production till it receives the technology, which seems unlikely. And some of this has to do with the Chinese government's diktats last year, which prevent the transfer of certain technologies, know-how, even personnel to Indian firms. The other example is Amara Raja, which is again, one of the leading battery manufacturers. They are also investing in LFP. Amara Raja had signed a technical licensing agreement with GIB Energy X, which is actually a subsidiary of Goshen High-Tech company, which is a Chinese firm. But this licensing agreement was actually not signed in China, but was signed in a third other country, where GIB Energy X set up their subsidiary. And this is one of the ways where Indian firms are sort of finding a workaround to engage with their Chinese partners, where even if you have Chinese firms who are interested, excuse me, in partnering with Indian firms, they have to find workarounds to try and do this. And some of this obviously has to do with sort of the reluctance of suppliers, Chinese players, but also reluctance of the Chinese government. There are some demand side factors to doing tech transfers, and this has to do with things like electricity cost, the issues such as land clearance and regulatory barriers. And these are some of the steps that the government can take, but it is sort of a big question mark as to the level of tech transfers that will actually happen. There have been some interesting cases where um, of indigenous development. You have firms such as Godi and Ola Electric that have designed their batteries and cells indigenously, but we are yet to see sort of commercial level scale production for most of these. I think Ola is one of the only few that has managed to um, make these indigenously developed battery cells commercially available.
Great. Thanks, Shreyas. I think we're almost at time, so we will wrap here. Before we conclude, please feel free to connect with us on at our newsletter. Here's the QR code you can scan to be added to our newsletter distribution list. And Shreyas, correct me if I'm wrong, but the takeaways and recommendations that you've explained to us today will be coming out in a policy brief over the next month or two. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. So if you're interested in connecting further with Shreyas, please do. And thank you everyone for joining. And please stay in touch. Have a great rest of your day.